Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Caitlin Allen, and I am one of the editors here at Hoard's Dairyman. We are pleased to partner with Provimi for today's webinar covering heat stress, which we all know happens, but we always want to minimize those significant effects of heat stress. Today, we're happy to have Tim Thompson here to bust some common myths around heat stress and offer some tips to better help dairy cows tolerate heat as it's starting to warm up around the country finally. Tim has almost 40 years of experience in dairy nutrition and is a dairy specialist with Provimi. So Tim, I'll briefly turn it over to you and let you share a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today.
Well, thank you, Caitlin. Today we're going to be talking about busting these heat stress myths. One of the things that a lot of times I'll hear people talk about is busting heat stress myths. One of the things that a lot of people will talk about is various things as what do we need? You know, it's temperature's fine in here. One of the things we've got to keep in mind is for us, our basal temperature is at around 72 degrees. These cows' basal temperature is around 40 degrees. They are going to be when we're comfortable, they're not. They're going to be very heat stressed. So we definitely want to go in here and we want to make sure these cows are going to be comfortable all the time. So we need to address that. We're going to go over some solutions here to try to mitigate heat stress as much as possible. There's a number of things we can do on the farm and things we can do nutritionally that can benefit the cow. Lose less this summer. One of the things that's the big thing is the dairy industry in the United States loses about $897 million in production to heat stress every year. It's going to happen. There's not that we can 100% prevent it. The only way we could prevent it is if you had an air conditioner. Not feasible, not going to happen. So all we're going to try to do is we're going to try to do as much as we possibly can to keep our losses at a minimum. So let's get on. We're going to go on with the poll question here.
Yes, thank you, Tim. We'll go ahead and put our first poll question up to learn a little bit about our audience today. So go ahead and answer this question. What type of heat stress mitigation do you have on your farm? Active cooling only, that can be fans, sprinklers using cross-ventilated or naturally ventilated barns, diet changes, or a combination of active cooling and diet changes. We'll give everybody a little bit of time to answer the question here. And let's go ahead and see what our audience says to this poll. So we've got a good group here combining active cooling as well as diet changes. That's certainly interesting for our presentation here today. So Tim, I'll turn it back over to you to dive a little deeper into that.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. So let's go. We're going to start with myth number one, that basically that heat abatement on the farm management practices are enough. And one of the things that when we look at this, again, I want to go back to that. A lot of times I've been in barns many times, and we're standing in the middle of the feed alley, and geez, it's really nice in here. And it probably is. It does feel pretty nice in there. The problem is when we get down, and when we get down with our head 2 feet off the ground, in between two cows in the stalls, that temperature could be anywhere from 5 to 10, maybe even 15 degrees warmer. Again, depending on what kind of heat abatement we have in the barn. One of the first things there that's going to help that is air movement. We need to have air movement over these cows, so we're getting the stale air out in between the cows. When you have these two very large animals sitting there, laying down, breathing into each other, they're releasing all kinds of humidity, air. They're producing all kinds of temperature, and that temperature can elevate in between these cows. So while we're standing out in the center of the barn and we have a nice breeze blowing through on us, it is pretty nice, and it's nice for us. But for that cow who's very comfortable at 40 degrees, it's starting to get very hot for her. So we need to have that air movement in there to remove that air out from between them and get that humidity out of there as well. The air needs to be moving over these cows. Roughly, we need about a good 4 to 6 mile an hour wind in order to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish here, getting this air out of there. I've been in some barns where they've had almost too much air, so we don't want that excessive air because that's not comfortable either. The other thing that we got to be very cognizant of is the placement of the fans and how that air is blowing. More and more people are using the dried solids, the separated solids as bedding. These are very, very fine particulates. They can be blown all over the place. If we have the fan blowing in the wrong area, blowing down on the stall instead of blowing across just over the top of the cows, you start blowing them particulates around, even with fine sand, and even mattresses with bedding on top of them. You're going to blow the bedding right off the mattresses if you have those fans directing in the wrong direction. But when we're blowing those little particulates around, you're going to be blowing that in their eyes. They're going to be breathing it in. That's going to make them cows more susceptible to pink eye, more susceptible to pneumonia, etc. So air movement is a big, big factor here. And we also got to get it. We also got to get it out of the barn as well. So we need to make sure we're moving that air and getting it out of there. Next one is water. So water intake. Water intake by these cows. We need to have enough water so these animals can drink enough and to help cool them. Water is the big cooling factor in cows. So water, when we're talking about battling heat stress, everything really centers around water, both internally and externally. When we look at water, these cows are going to drink under normal conditions. They're going to drink about roughly 3 times their dry matter intakes in water. But then they're also going to have to produce enough. They're going to have to drink enough water to replace the water lost in milk production. So when you got cows producing 100 pounds of milk, that's 88 pounds of water that has to go through that animal and leave every day. So we need to have enough water for that. With that said, we need about 3 linear inches of water space per cow in the drinking, for them to drink from. And that needs to be clean water. It can't be dirty. It can't have a bunch of feed and stuff and algae and everything else. We need absolutely clean, fresh water in those pens available to these cows. A lot of times during when we get under heat stress, these cows are going to, their dry matter intake, the water intake can go up to as much as 5 times the dry matter intake if they're under heat stress. So we need to have plenty of water there. A lot of times in the summertime, a good idea is to put water in the return alleys. If we can have water in the return alleys, they've shown where cattle will drink up to 33% of their needs from them return alleys, so it doesn't put so many animals around the drinking fountain, fountains that we have throughout the barn. So having that water is really essential. Ideally, when we have water in the return alleys, we're going to want to have enough water space so that let's say you have a parallel parlor and you have let's say a double 12. So in a parallel parlor like that, you want to have enough water space for 2 feet for half the parlor. So in a double 12, we need to have 24 feet of water space so them cattle can exit the parlor and they all can get up and drink. And we're going to have plenty of water in there to drink. As far as water is concerned, there's lots of them that have been made with just 10-inch PVC pipe with a float on one end and a drain on the other end. And that works very well to get water into those cows. Very inexpensive and very easy to keep clean. The other use of water is external, the use of water. So using as sprinklers, they've shown fans work nice, but the combination of fans and water is really what cools these cows. You want an example of that? Drive down the road, stick your arm out the window. Bring your arm back in, spray it down with water, then stick it out the window. When that evaporative cooling really pulls heat off the animals. And that's what we want to accomplish with these sprinklers. When we're using these sprinklers, number one, we want to have them set correctly. Too often, people put them too high, and then if we got good air movement in the barn, we have water blowing back on the feed. We don't want that. So we want to set them sprinklers. So ideally, if you can get them out of the cow's reach, that's great, but too often that gets them up too high. And so every once in a while, you might have to replace a nozzle, but that's a very cheap thing to pay for compared to putting too much water on the feed and heating our feed in the feed bunk. So we want to make sure our sprinklers are set. Also, we want to make sure that sprinkler is spraying over the shoulders and rumen of the cow. We don't want it to be spraying over the rear hump, the rear hips, and the rear end of the cow, because that water just runs down, and then whatever dirt, manure, etc., all gets washed to the udder. We don't want to do that. We want to keep that water directly kind of over the back, over the rumen. So number one, we aren't bringing all this material down to the udder and the teat ends, but as well as we want to keep that water over where the heat is really being created. We have an animal that's producing 80, 90, 100 pounds of milk. These cows have an extremely high metabolism to do this. So they're making a lot of heat on top of it. But then they also have this thing called a rumen. And this rumen is a big fermentation vat. And anytime we have fermentation, we have heat. And this heat, so she's just producing heat, producing heat. This is why we need to go to the extreme to keep these cows cool. Like I said, they're comfortable at about 40, 42 degrees THI. And to us, that's very, very cool. So also when we use these sprinklers, we're going to vary them as far as when we're sprinkling the cows. There's a lot of different places, a lot of different suggestions out there. They want to talk about putting them, the old advantage was, put them on for 3 minutes, off for 12. So every 15 minutes, you're going through a cycle. That's great if it's, temperatures, the THI is in the low 70s in the barn. That's fine. That's good to go with. But then as that temperature starts going up a little hotter, we probably want to sprinkle a little more. So then a lot of times we'll go to 2.5 minutes on, 7.5 minutes off. So every 10 minutes, we're going to be sprinkling through the barn. And then when we get to extreme heat, we probably want to get that sprinkler going on a little more often. So we make sure so all cows get a chance to get water on them. And maybe we'll run that sprinkler 1.5 minutes and 3.5 minutes off. So every 5 minutes, there's a cycle going through. A couple of weeks ago, I was down in Florida, and we were going through a herd, and it was 90-something, 95 degrees down there. And but these cows were fairly comfortable. They had fans galore in there. They had very good air movement. It was a big open-sided barn down there. They mostly just provide shade, and then they have these big open-sided barns, and it was the air movement was excellent. But what he was doing was sprinklers were running 12 seconds on, and then they'd turn off and they go to the next pen, but they're continuous. So every 48 seconds coming around, that cow would get another sprinkle again. So 12 seconds and then go around the barn. And at first I thought, geez, they're going through a lot of water. But when I got done and started figuring on it, there's no more water use there in a 15-minute period than we would at the 2.5 minutes on, 7.5 minutes off. So it was I thought it was a very effective use of water, and we were really getting water on these cows, and a lot of the cows were getting wet. We weren't missing cows, and I thought I was very intrigued with that, and I thought it was an excellent use of sprinkling system for keeping the cows cool. So that was really interesting. One of the other things we can do is feed at night. Cows they're going to eat a majority of their feed. They like to eat big meals at just before dusk. So late in the afternoon, that's when they do their eating anyway, or big meals anyway. So when heat comes on during the heat of the day, they are really not too excited about going up and getting feed. So a lot of times when we have people feeding at night, we can get cows eating as much as 2/3 of their total intake at night compared to during the day under heat stress. So by feeding at night, we can provide fresh feed to when they're going to eat it the most. So rather than putting down a single feeding early in the morning and then having to sit there for most of the day, they'll eat on it all day long, but the majority of it's going to get eaten at night. So rather than having to sit there all that time, we can bring fresh feed to those cows when they need it the most. If you feed twice a day, you could even go 1/3 feeding at night and feeding in the morning, and 2/3 at night. Some of those types of things, especially on these extreme heat days, might be a benefit to maximize dry matter intake, because that's at the bottom line. That's what we're trying to do, is maximize dry matter intakes under these heat stress conditions. TMR preservers, these are also another one to look at. Depending on your forage situation, the fermentation your forages went through, there are some inoculants out there that do help with bunk life. All those things into consideration, but bottom line, if your bunk is heating, you probably want to look at maybe putting a TMR preserver in there and to just provide some protection for that feed, to keep that feed from going bad. Once that feed starts to warm up, again, we're going to start depressing dry matter intakes. Matter of fact, I just did some figuring for a farm this morning, and it's roughly in that 17-20 cents per head per day to use a TMR preserver. But if we get a little more intake, we can make that up we get that return on that investment very, very quickly if your feeds are heating. So a lot of these things we talk about here, everybody's conditions are going to be different. So your barn and everything else is going to be different. So you really need to watch your cows and let your cows tell you, are they hot or not? Easiest way to do that is look at respiration rates. When that temperature is, when your THI is under 68, your cows' respiration rates typically are going to be under 60. As soon as that respiration rates start to get in them low 60s, 61 to 65 respirations per minute, that cow is starting to experience some kind of heat stress. So our cows are telling us all the time what they want and what they need. We just have to listen. So that's one thing that I encourage everybody to do, is watch those cows and then modify your particular situation to try to overcome them. One of the last things that we can do, of course, on the nutritional side of things is there's some things that we can do from that side with decad balance and using osmolytes or vasodilators to help from a nutritional side to help with the cow. So all these things we talked about here, I mean, a lot of them are on the farm, but as you can see, there's other things we can do besides just what's going on in the farm to help that cow fight off heat stress. One of the myth number two is all these heat abatement feed additives are created equal. Well, there's a lot of them out there, and to be honest with you, they all do seem to work. They all help the cow, and they do help the cow in some form or fashion. So I do see they all have a value here. The problem is some are more cost effective than others, and some do a better job than others. So one of the things we're going to kind of talk about is just here's an example of the main three different ones that we have for feed heat abatement additives. When we look at vasodilators, these are organic compounds. Classic example of them is niacin or capsaicin. When we get to the electrolytes are positively charged inorganic minerals. Everybody's very familiar with electrolytes with calves, and sodium and potassium are our big electrolytes. Then it comes to osmolytes. These are small organic compounds that are actually found in nature, and they attract water molecules. So how do these different heat abatement additives work in the cow? So basically, vasodilators, these work to dilate the blood vessels. So what they do is they increase blood flow to the skin, allowing heat to dissipate off the animal. The animal is going to do this naturally. So they already are doing this. Vasodilators just come in and make it go harder, or make it go faster. So they just kind of pump it up a little bit. If you want to get a good example of what a vasodilator does, go to the drugstore or your nutrition store and get some niacin, and not the slow release type, just the straight niacin, and take that and then go look in the mirror and watch your face turn red, and you'll just feel the heat come off your face. It's a rather interesting experience. But or we all go to Buffalo Wild Wings and get the hot wings, and you get capsaicin, and everybody sweats and turns red and everything else. Same thing. These vasodilators can work very fast, so they don't necessarily need to be fed all the time. But so these would be more something along the lines of what we would refer to as a reactive heat abatement additive. Electrolytes, these are another one that are also in that reactive thing. We do not have to feed electrolytes all the time. They can be fed when needed. So whenever we come into a heat stress event, maybe the day before, start loading them up a little bit with some electrolytes, and then as soon as the heat abatement, or as soon as the heat subsides and comes back down a little bit to normal, we can take them out. So these work in the body. They help retain water in the cell and help prevent dehydration. So electrolytes, again, are another reactive form of feed additive that we can use on a daily basis, depending on when we need it or not. Again, here for an example for us, a lot of times I like to do this and refer to us, because sometimes it has more meaning when we go through it. I drink water all summer long. I drink a lot of water every day. But usually in the summertime, when I'm outside and I'm out in this heat, there gets to a point where I can't take it, the water just doesn't do it anymore. That's when I need some electrolytes. We're losing electrolytes and sweat and everything else, and it seems like just a bottle of Gatorade picks me back up and I'm ready to go again. So that's kind of what those electrolytes do for you. Osmolytes, these are very similar to electrolytes in the way they maintain cell hydration. But one of the big important things that osmolytes do is they help complement heat shock proteins. So in the cells we have cellular protein. So when you get sick, when an animal gets sick, the body temperature goes up, and the animal, what the body's trying to do is it's trying to raise the temperature up, because we're trying to destroy the cell proteins in the bacteria or virus. We're trying to counteract that and trying to destroy them to make them they can't work anymore. That's what the body's trying to do to fight off disease. Same things happens in heat stress, but only now that heat stress is pushing that temperature above and beyond, and it's pushing it, and it's attacking the cells of the animal. So it's bringing that damage to the animals, where these cellular proteins, they start to aggregate. Heat shock proteins are in there to try to keep them from aggregating and try to prevent that cellular destruction and that cellular shrinkage. These osmolytes work together with these heat shock proteins to help prevent that. This is the reason why over the summer, as summer goes on, we see this effect, and people have experienced it too. When the first signs of heat come in, we welcome that. Oh, thank God, we've been freezing, for the last 7 months up here in Minnesota. We welcome that heat coming in. But at the end of the summer, the last thing I want to see is another 85, 90-degree day, because my body's sick of it. It doesn't recover from it very well anymore. But using an osmolyte, we can help them heat shock proteins protect themselves. So we're not going to be at the mercy of the weather quite as much. When we look at these, they all have their pros and cons. Vasodilators, pros on them, they can be fed only as needed. So that's a good one too. But the cons to vasodilators are they do have a tendency to decrease blood flow to the intestinal tract. They also decrease blood flow to the rumen. Now, the rumen has many things to control pH. Sodium bicarb in the saliva is a buffer. So the rumen mat itself is a giant hydrogen sink. It's a giant buffer in there too. But one of the most important ways that a rumen buffers itself, keeps itself buffered, is the rumen papillae pulling the fatty acids, the volatile fatty acids that are being produced, pulling them out of the rumen. If we have decreased blood flow to the rumen, we're going to have decrease of these fatty acids being absorbed and taken out of the rumen. And also at the gastrointestinal tract, we're going to set these animals up. If we have the cellular damage going on down there, we're going to set them up for leaky gut syndrome. So then bacteria and viruses can pass through the intestinal tract into the body. We need to prevent that. So that's vasodilators, especially when vasodilators are fed by themselves, can have a tendency to set cows up for this. Also, some of the research on these vasodilators has been a little bit iffy. It hasn't been truly consistent in research. So they're a value, but I wouldn't hang my hat solely on vasodilators. Electrolytes, again, another one of the reactive additives. We can feed that only when we need it. It helps replace the sodium and potassium the animals are losing in sweat, and as well as just plain milk production. Heavy producing cows, we often think of calcium going out with milk, but even more so, potassium goes out in the milk as well. So we need to replace those electrolytes, and so using electrolytes on when needed as the heat comes on during the summer can be a huge benefit. The cons to that, though, is electrolytes are a short-term solution, and in the effect of So as far as dry cows are concerned, we can't use the electrolytes there because of the decant. So we're going to bring on hypocalcemia, so we got to avoid, we can't use electrolytes there. So that's a con for that. And the other problem with electrolytes are, although they keep water in the cells, as do osmolytes, they do not have any effect on the heat shock proteins. So when it comes to that, they are not a benefit. Okay, when we get to the osmolytes, the pros of the osmolytes are, again, it works at the cellular level, similar to electrolytes, with keeping the volume and cell hydration going. But it also works with these heat shock proteins, and it keeps that cellular damage from occurring and keeps those cells hydrated and going. And so then we don't have this ratcheting down effect and heat effect on the cows that seems to affect cows when they're not fed them. Then the other pro is, of course, it can be fed to dry cows. The con with an osmolyte is this cannot be fed reactively. It's got to be fed proactively. We have to put it in the diet. We have to pick a time. We're going to put it in the diet, and we're going to leave it in the diet until we're done using it for the season. So that's the only con about using osmolytes for protection against heat stress. We have to have this accumulation process that gets out throughout the whole body. So. Heat abatement solutions, most impactful in the beginning of summer. This is, and one of the things, we talk about when we get that first heat, like I said, that first heat that comes in really doesn't harm them a lot. I mean, a lot of times, if we're really good with getting our fans on and maybe a little water, we can kind of get through some of that right at the beginning. But as time goes on, them are not going to do the job. And that's where we need to have some of these other benefits of trying to help these cows throughout the summer. This is just this is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. They give every year, they put out a guess. So here, this was made in April, and they said for May, June, and July for this year, basically the upper Midwest is looking at an equal chance of being hotter than normal or being cooler than normal. So not too much excitement there. But you can see as you move to the Southwest here, that intensifies, and you're going to get, we start going to 50 to 55, 60, 70, 80% chance of it being warmer than normal. So right now, it don't look too bad for the upper Midwest, but for the Southwest, there's going to be quite a bit of heat coming on. And this is their next guess, if you will, at what's going to happen in June, July, and August. And you can see by the end of summer here, for this particular summer, we're looking at 55 to maybe even 60% chance that it's going to be a lot higher than normal temperature than normal. So as for this summer, from this standpoint, as summer goes on, not only our cows are going to be getting worn out, but also they're going to be having more pressure on them as time goes on. The thing that I look at every year, and this is every year, in the spring, the barn itself is a lot cooler place. We just came out of winter, and we see this with big cities. Big cities are like heat sinks, and when you look at satellite pictures and you look at temperature, these big cities, all that concrete it holds a lot of heat, but it holds a lot of cool too. So what happens in the spring with our barns, it takes a while to heat that barn up. So again, in the spring, it's relatively easy with water and a little bit of water and some fans blowing on, and sometimes just fans. We can keep that temperature a little cooler so the cows don't get so stressed. Again, watch your cows. Doing respiration rates on cows is your best indicator of are my cows being stressed or are they just fine. But as the summer goes on, that barn starts to heat up. And now it's harder and harder. And as the humidity heats up, temperature outside heats up, that barn becomes harder and harder to keep cool with water or keep cool with air movement. And that's where the water has to be coming in to try to keep those cows cool. And we're trying to use evaporated cooling to help us out a little bit. But that barn is continuing to heat. It's getting higher humidity in it, harder and harder to cool down. And also these heat bouts that are coming through are kind of beating on our cows a little bit. pushing them down a little more, pushing them down a little more. Then by late summer and early fall, at this point, the cows have about had it with they've had multiple rounds of heat stress, and they've about had it with heat. So they have a very hard time recovering from it. So without giving them some help nutritionally, they're going to have a very hard time recovering. And that's what I'm talking about with this ratcheting effect as they go down in milk production. So when I look at this, I'm more concerned about making sure I'm helping these cows in midsummer to late summer for definitely more important than early spring. Early spring, it's all important, but early spring is not as important as late fall. One of the other myths, heat abatement, dry cows, they're not milking, so we don't have to worry about our dry cows. They're not milking yet. So that's a big myth. And for many, many years, we looked at it like that. But all the work that Jeff Dahl has done out of the University of Florida has kind of proven that when it comes to heat, we really need to treat our dry cows like our lactating herd. We have to have shade for them. Got to get the sun off them. So we got to have that shade. It's going to help reduce that radiant heat stress. We got to have air movement, just like our milk cows. We need the same kind of air movement to get the heat off them and everything else. Get the heat off, humidity out of the barn. Water, we still need that. We still need cool drinking water. Now they don't milk, so that's a bunch of water we don't have to replace, and their dry matter intakes are a lot less. So they're not going to drink as much water. So usually 1 inch of linear water space in our waters per cow is going to be sufficient to provide enough water for the cows. But again, needs to be clean water. We need to have clean drinking cups, drinking fountains. We also need to probably bring in a little sprinkling of water on these cows. We don't have to get it as intense as we do on the lactating cows, because these cows are not producing as much heat, because they are not metabolically as much driven like the lactating cows. They're not eating as much, they're not fermenting as much, but we do need some water. The use of water and air, especially as the summer heats up and these cows go through multiple heat bouts, we do need to bring some water in there to help keep them cool. Again, TMR preservers, same instance. Most of these dry cows are going to be fed hopefully once a day. Too many times we're feeding them once every 2 days. And that just does not work in the summertime. But hopefully we're feeding them once a day. But even then, it's not going to keep it. And especially when we get into these pre-fresh cows, they have all kinds of things hormonally driving them intakes down as we approach freshening. The last thing we want to be doing is driving intakes down by having a TMR that's heating on them. So the use of TMR preservers are also very valuable. In the micronutrition, the mineral adjustments, when we're looking at these animals are going to be on a negative DCAD balance. So electrolytes are one of the first lines of defense for these cows to help fight heat stress off. And we're putting these cows on a negative DCAD balance. So we have taken just about everything away from a nutrition side of things to be able to fight off and keep these animals hydrated. So that's where most of the heat abatement products out there do contain electrolytes. So you have to be very, very careful of using these products. I've seen some that they say they're DCAD neutral, so you don't have to adjust anything. But I think when they talk about DCAD neutral, yeah, it's DCAD neutral in the milking cow lactating ration, but it's not going to be DCAD neutral in the dry cow period. So because they're providing potassium and sodium, and you are going to and if it's a true electrolyte product, you are going to raise havoc with the DCAD on your dry cows. So most of these products can't be used here. The other thing Jeff Dahl's found down there is, and this has been out in popular press here for a while now, for the last couple of years, but this impact of this heat stress on the in utero calves as far as longevity and production. So number one, cows that go through heat stress and during their lactation, we're going to lose 10 pounds, maybe even more, depending on your situation. If they go through severe heat stress, we're going to lose that in that current lactation, 10 pounds per day or more. So we're going to lose that milk on that lactation. This is often why we see, when we look at the U.S. production of milk in the whole across the United States, Our lowest months are September, October, and November. Why is that? Because our fresh cows were dry during July and August. So this is the importance of what's going on with these dry cows. We need to keep them cool. We need to address heat stress in every avenue we can to keep them cool, to try to mitigate that as much as possible. Even now, I'm going to just step away here and talk about on the breeds. Holsteins, this really hits Holsteins hard. Jerseys love heat. I work with a lot of Jersey herds, and we often see our peak milk production is July and August. But with that said, even Jerseys, after a couple months of that heat, they even kind of get sick of it. And we do see our cows dropping off more in lactation as we go into the fall here, September and October. But even dry cows there, they're going to suffer from that heat stress as well. And so then we see that same thing in the Jerseys. Now the problem that we see with the Jerseys then is, okay, if we get them ratcheting down too bad September and October, November, then we come into December, January, and February. December, January, and February is not kind to Jerseys in Minnesota or Wisconsin. It's extremely cold. They suffer cold stress a lot worse than Holsteins do. So now if we start ratcheting them down already in the fall, now we come to winter, now we're going to ratchet them down even more. So for really any of the dairy cattle, like I said, even though Jerseys are pretty in tune to the heat, it doesn't bother them quite as much. We see these benefits by really taking care of these dry cows and lactating cows from a heat stress abatement, no matter what the breed. The other just exciting information that comes out of there, and we look at this, and it's almost hard to imagine, but the effect on the heifer she's carrying. They've shown that these calves that are exposed to heat stress in utero are lighter and shorter at birth and at weaning. They're also less likely to survive to even get to lactation. They're more susceptible to diseases, etc. So not only are we messing with our cow that's going to be milking here in 60 days, but we're also screwing up an animal that's not even going to come into milk production for 2 years. It's showing that once these cows enter the lactating herd, these heifers that are born to these cows that were heat stressed during the dry can produce as much as 10 pounds of milk or more across their entire first, second, and third lactations. So you can see heat stress really has an everlasting effect on these animals. So I guess it's time for a poll question.
Yes, thank you, Tim, for sharing all of that information. And before we go through a few more solutions to some of those, we'll do one more poll question for our audience. And so we saw that quite a few people were making diet changes with our first poll. So this one asks, what type of diet changes are you making during heat stress periods? Is that changes to energy levels, protein levels, fat levels? Not sure, or you're not making changes to the diet during heat stress. Give everyone a little more time to answer this question. And let's go ahead and see what our audience said here. So a lot of people making changes to energy with fat close behind. Tim, I'll turn it back over to you if you have any thoughts on those results and some more solutions.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, and a lot of times we do make these adjustments to nutritionally to the rations, and one of the big things that a lot of people do are, because we know we're going to have some lower dry matter intakes, they do make adjustments to the energy of the rations, use of yeast culture, things like that to help try to keep the rumen more stabilized, are all benefits. The use of more sodium bicarb, DCAD plus as electrolytes, them are all going to be benefits. A lot of times we'll have, maybe during the winter time, we might only have up to 25 DCAD on our ration, and maybe once we start to get into summer, maybe we'll bump that DCAD up a little higher, maybe bump it up to 30 or so as we get into the summer months. Those types of things are all benefits to when we're putting these rations together. One other important benefit that we feel is our solutions managing heat stress is I.C.E. I.C.E. stands for internal cooling elements. We know heat stress is going to be a given. We know that every summer. I mean, it's like I said in the beginning, outside of putting in an air conditioner, we're going to have heat. So whatever we can do from the heat abatement side of things is going to be a benefit. As these cows heat up, we know dry matter intakes are going to go down. We know when dry matter intakes go down, so does milk production. But these significant losses don't have to be the norm. We've got some things that we can do to help that cow cool herself. Promote Ice Plus is a proven heat stress additive that we've used over the years. We've had this out, we've had it in different research trials over the years, and we've had over 20 years experience out in the field, and it's proven itself that it does help these cows handle the heat. We don't see these cows drop off so much when the heat bouts come in. We see them recover, and we see benefits from the reproduction side as well. Promote Ice Plus, it's a proprietary combination of key ingredients. It's a synergistic blend of these key ingredients that help the cows better regulate their body temperature during heat stress. It works at the cellular level to basically try to keep these cows cool, essentially from the inside out. And all the data that we've researched over the years, we've shown on average, it's about a 5-to-1 return investment on reducing milk production and other production losses during heat stress. Here's a trial that we did down in Brazil, and it was we just monitored the cows' temperatures from the inside out. We put core body temperature monitors in them, and as you can see throughout the day, the cows on ice in the blue line compared to the cows without ice in the black line, they were about a 1/2 degree or 0.6 of a degree cooler throughout the day just from the ice. When it comes to reproduction and that first 8 days on the embryo, this is a big deal. This is the difference between getting a cow pregnant and not. So here's our trial from Indiana. We did it back in 2013. This was a 2-month trial. This is the first month in July, and you can see here. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but here's the dotted line here. This is when THI, the thermal heat index, exceeds 68 degrees. And you can see prior to that, here the cows were. We got the black line again is the diet without promote in it, and the blue line is the diet with ice in it. And here we go, and right now we're not having any temperature, and the cows are pretty much staying in the same ballpark. But then we start to get a bout of heat, and after that bout of heat comes through, look at how all these cows drop. The cows without ice drop significantly more than the cows with ice. And then all of a sudden, as we go along here, we're getting into the mid of July. We got another heat bout that comes in, and again, the heat index jumps up above that 68 threshold. And you can see here again, the cows start to make this drop. And this is typically what we see with ice. The cows on ice don't drop as far. But then now look at as the heat subsides, the cows start to come back up again, and you can see that blue line comes back up basically to where they were before the heat. The black line doesn't. So the diets without ice in them, they don't come back. This is that ratcheting effect I was talking about. And now the next bout of heat, it'll do the same thing. Both will go down. The ice cows don't go down as far, and then they come back to where they were before, or close to where they were before. This is at the end of the trial over the 2-month period. We looked at what them cows did. These were high-producing cows, and they were actually in very good facilities as far as heat abatement was concerned. And you can see the cows without ice average about 104.5 pounds of milk, where the cows on ice averaged 106.7. So an additional 2 pounds plus on milk production from the cows on ice compared to the cows not on ice. This is a pregnancy trial we did down in Texas. This is back in 2009, and what we did was we inseminated a bunch of cows. We had some on control without ice, and then we had some on diet with ice in it. And as you can see there, we had about the diet without ice, 14% got pregnant, whereas the diet cows with the ice in it had almost a 21% pregnancy rate. So that's basically about 50% more cows got pregnant on the diet with the ice in it. So our recommended use of Promote Ice Plus is to basically monitor your current and history weather patterns. Know when heat is going to be expected. So when that heat, and basically when I mean heat, what I'm looking for is, again, nighttime temperatures. When that nighttime temperature quits dropping in the 50s, when it starts to stay in the 60s, we want to know when that period is going to come. So about 10 to 14 days prior to that, we want to get ice in there, because we want to get it throughout the body. We want to load the animal up so the animal's prepared when the temperature comes in. Again, beginning of the year, try to hit this as close as you can. If you don't hit it right on, don't worry about it. It's not as big a deal. Just get there as close as you can. And then once you have it in, keep it in the entire summer. Then when you have bouts of heat stress coming in, use your electrolytes, potassium and sodium from sodium bicarb, DCAD plus. Use them on a daily basis as needed to just help the cows. When the temperature's in the low 80s, low to mid 80s, a couple ounces of DCAD plus and a couple ounces of bicarb go a long way. As far as bringing a bunch of electrolytes in there, it's probably going to be more than most heat abatement additives are going to put in there for a very reasonable price. When you get them a couple days and it starts getting up when we get those days in the 90s, to go ahead and put a little more, go up to 3-4 ounces of each for a day or two, just to bring those electrolytes in there. And you're going to find these cows are going to be able to handle that heat a lot better. And then continue feeding ice. And then once the temperature starts to come out, where at night we start to get in the 50s again and we're not in the 60s anymore, then you can pull ice out of the rations. We have ice available in 2 different packages. We have a premix that's designed to be used at the mill level, where we can mix it in the grain mixes, protein mixes, any kind of supplements, that type of thing. And we do have a farm pack that is designed to be used added to the TMR on the farm. So we have pretty much needs to fit most needs. We have some literature and some tools that you can use to calculate what you might be losing, additional milk pounds, or what might be the benefit of using ice, and what might be the return on your dollar spent that you can put in your cows, your heat duration that's typical in your area, average milk production per day, current milk price, and then we have a place there for what kind of current heat abatement do you have, because if you have fans and sprinklers, whereas if you have nothing, that type of thing, or if you have one or the other, that's going to have an effect on what kind of a return you're going to get. So you can kind of look at all those things. So with that said, I'm done with the presentation. So if you have any questions, I'd be glad to take them at this time.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, and we will go to some questions now to dig a little deeper into everything you were talking about. We'll invite you to turn your webcam back on too.
Thank you, Kayla.
Perfect.
Forget that.
And I think where we'll start here on the questions, you talked that probably mid to late summer is where we should most be focused on heat stress abatement. But when do you recommend producers start looking at their heat abatement practices? What part of that summer heat stress area?
Well, so first thing we want to do is, before the heat comes, we want to make sure everything works. So we don't want to wait till the day that, okay, it's 90 degrees out, turn the fans on, oh God, they don't work. We want to make sure they're up in working order and they're clean. Dirty fans, you can cut down half the air on a dirty fan. So make sure your fans are cleaned, everything's working correctly. We don't have any electrical problems or anything else that's going on. We want to make sure that's all in place. We want to make sure our sprinklers are working. Are we missing nozzles? What's broke? What's not? Let's get all that stuff into effect. So make sure all that stuff is up and running before the heat comes. And then, to be honest, when we start getting, when that temperature starts getting 60 to 65 degrees outside, it's probably a lot harder in between the cows. So you want to start your fans. So start getting your fans moving. And again, like I said before, watch your cows. They'll tell you. And if they're breathing more than 60 breaths per minute, they're getting heat stress. So now we got to start moving and get going on fans, water, etc.
Yep, great points. And throughout that summer, how often are you talking with your customers about feed abatement practices, and how often are you reevaluating how effective that's being?
Again, we're kind of going and just looking at the cows and letting the cows tell us. And when I walk through the barn, if I walk through and there's a lot of cows panting, whatever we're doing is not working. So we have to reevaluate. So just watch the cows. They'll tell you.
Yep, great point. We talked a little bit about dry cow heat abatement, and most of this was about lactating cows, but do you have any suggestions on calves and heifers after they're born? What can we look at in that space?
I mean, so all these animals are gonna experience heat stress. Calves and heifers don't experience it. It's not as bad on them as it is on cows. Number one, cows are producing milk, so metabolically they're producing a lot more heat, but they're plain just younger. I mean, it's when you get up, my grandkids and they don't have a problem running around in the heat, and it's like, okay, they can handle it a lot better. But so shade and air movement, them things, again, watch your animals. If they're breathing, if their respiration rates are getting high, they're getting hot. Do something to fix it. Usually with heifers, shade and air movement is going to be sufficient. But again, watch the animals.
Do you have a number on what respiration rate we should look at in calves to know when they're starting to be heat stressed?
From what I understand, I think once the animals start breathing more than 60 breaths per minute, they're getting stressed. So I think we can use that on calves as far as I know.
Okay, thank you. This question comes in, it says, what dietary changes in the context of the RDP to DUP ratio are helpful?
So I think what they're referring to, a lot of times when cows start going through heat stress, their muns go up. And their muns are going up because what's happening is when the cow goes through heat stress and her dry matter intakes start to drop, she starts looking for energy. And what she actually does, she does not use fat. She starts to break down muscle tissue. So she's starting to break down muscle tissue. When she's breaking down muscle tissue to use as an energy source, we have the protein that becomes available. That is one of the big factors of why muns go up, is this degradation of body proteins. So as far as RDP and RUP, that's I don't make too big of changes on that. I try to go after the front end of the cow to make sure we're getting her cool and doing them types of things rather than start messing around with my degradable protein in the ration.
Sure, thank you. When we're talking about promote ICE Plus, is it also effective in warmer climates that maybe are experiencing heat stress maybe year round even? Is that a good solution in that environment as well?
So, and I would say yes. And the reason I say that is, cows do become climatized. I mean, so, cows down south do get used to the heat, but they're not going to get used to the heat to the point that, okay, now instead of being comfortable at 40 degrees, now they're comfortable at 70 degrees. No, that's not going to happen. They might be a little more comfortable at 50 degrees than what our cows are up north. So they are going to be a little more climatized to it, but they're in it all the time. They need some help. And so it is going to be a benefit to them as well. And that is a thing that a lot of people think that, oh, they're more used to it. They're not going to be used to it. When we come, I've lived in Minnesota my entire life, and I'll go places, 50 degrees, I'm perfectly comfortable. But you know what? At 30 degrees, I need a jacket. Same thing with these cows. At 50 degrees, 60 degrees, they're probably comfortable down there. But when they're at 70, 80, 90 degrees, they're not comfortable. So they need some help. They need help.
Yeah, great point.
So ICE Plus would be a benefit to them too.
This question says, what about feeding sodium chloride? Would that be helpful? Any thoughts on that?
No, so sodium chloride, so basically salt, we don't want to, chloride is the opposite of electrolyte. So we want to lower chlorides as much as possible. The cow needs a certain amount of chlorides, but if we can push chlorides down a little bit, we're going to benefit the animal. Because chlorides are the opposite of what the electrolytes are going to do. So we want to get that down. So a lot of times cows will go after salt, but they're going after salt because they want the sodium. They can't separate the sodium from the chloride, so they eat the sodium, the salt, to get the sodium.
Sure.
But unfortunately, the chlorides come with it.
Sure. Now, we talked about this in a dairy application today. Someone is asking, can this also be beneficial in feedlots or cow-calf operations?
Yes, all cows are going to experience heat stress, and the thing of it is with beef cattle have thicker hides than dairy cattle do. So beef cattle, they're going to suffer from heat just as much as dairy cattle. And beef cattle, they don't have the metabolism because they're not producing as much milk and that type of thing. But beef cattle have thick hides, and beef cattle are on very high forage diets, and forages produce a lot of heat. And usually beef cattle are on very poor forage. And so they're going to produce a lot of heat. So definitely this is a benefit to all forms of cattle.
Great point. When we're looking at sprinkler size, sprinkler droplet size, should we be looking at coarse or fine sizes?
We want a coarse sprinkler droplet. Number one, we want a coarse sprinkler droplet for the main reason we want to soak the cow down. The other problem is when we have fine droplets, they blow around. And then the fine droplets, a lot of times, will get blown on the feed, and it makes our feed wet. So we want coarse droplets that go down. So we want to soak that cow to the skin.
Great point.
Them fine droplets will actually create a blanket on the cow, and now it holds heat in.
Another thing that's been explored for heat stress is the slick gene. Do you have any thoughts on breeding for that trait for heat stress?
I'm sorry, I don't have any knowledge of
That's okay.
I wouldn't be able to answer that.
No worries, no worries. I think one more question we'll wrap up with. We talked about we can feed Promote Ice Plus in warmer climates throughout the year, but would it also be as effective if it's fed only during heat stress events?
So we want to feed it. We want to feed it when again before heat stress events come on, and we want to keep feeding it. When we take it in and out of the diet, we don't keep the cow loaded up on it. So that's the one problem with osmolytes is you need to put it in the diet and leave it in the diet. When we can't electrolytes, we can take in and out as needed, but this one we can't. We got to kind of put it in and leave it.
Great point. Yes. Well, I think that is a good place to wrap up our questions. Thank you, Tim, for sharing all that information with us. If you want to go one more slide, I think we've got a little more information for our attendees. We hope everyone learned something here today about managing heat stress, and we thank Provimi for their support of this webinar. If you want some more information, you can contact your nutritionist or local feed mill or feedpromote.com/dairy. You can also scan that QR code there to learn a little bit more. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.